truly am.
Hello, I am finally back with another video showing you how I made Fulgore's chest armor. Took me a long time to kind of get this all done, but I'm excited to show you how I did it, so let's get right into the video. To start things off, I made a template for the chest piece. Next, I made a template for the center flap thingy. Trace it onto 10mm HD foam and just trace a few lines to make a V-groove cut so I can bend it. I flipped it over, cut out the center portion to free up the outside flaps. After gluing and folding the main portion, I glued on the flap into a slope formation and glued on the side to complete the center portion. I transferred my chest template onto some 10mm HD foam and beveled the outer edges, and on the opposite end I added a lot of V-groove lines so I can fold my template onto itself. I applied a layer of contact cement in all of my V-groove cuts as well as some of the edges and waited till it was tacky to the touch, and once it was ready I just assembled the whole box together. Once it was fully assembled, this was my little rough draft, and the little extension piece on the end is where I'll have my hinge. You can see here that I'm just kind of test fitting all of my components and adjusting my templates accordingly if I needed to. I made two joining pieces for the center flap that'll share one hinge, and I'll have a hinge on each of the chest pieces so all of these pieces will be able to move independently. I made another piece that will attach to the chest armor but butt up against the flap. I made a template for the upper back and flipped it over to trace the other side because this particular piece needs to be mirrored. And once that was done, I cut it out and rounded off the edges with my Dremel and burned a line in it with my wood burning tool to give it more depth. I drew on my design on the foam and covered it with a layer of tape and retraced that template. And once that was done, I peeled off the tape and transferred it over to cardstock paper, which I was then able to cut out and trace onto HD foam, and added some details with my wood burner. I applied a layer of super glue on the triangle detail and inserted it into the hole so that it was offset. And here are the two back flaps. I offset the details on this as well and glued on the little buttons here in the corner. I glued on the upper middle portion and the two outer wings. I left the center portion left out because I'm going to have a hole there for the fan. For the lower back, I cut out two pieces of 10mm HD foam, one of which gets cut into a capital I, which I then glued onto the blank piece and moved on to a couple detail pieces for the back. This is the look so far after gluing everything together. To finish off the back, I made a template and made a little border around it, about a ½ inch. And once I was done, I used my wood burner to burn in the hard lines that I made on the inside. And once that was done, I'm able to glue and fold it onto itself so it builds up its own shape. Once that was all set up, I applied my contact cement and glued it on. Working my way back around, I made a template for the lower abdomen, split into two pieces. The little dotted line is where I'm going to cut into the paper that will trace over to the foam to let me know to do angled cuts in there as well. So I cut out my pattern, and once that was done, fill it with hot glue and of course fold it onto itself so it has a hard edge. Once that's done, I cut out the second half of that template, which is just a angle cut all the way around. So I glued that on, and since this is just one half of the abdomen piece, I went ahead and made a second. I made some guided lines along the abdomen and cut out a hole in a little divot for the little belly button area, which I just put some extra foam on the back end of it to fill up that gap. and glued everything together. Of course, I made another template, transferred over to foam, made my V-groove cuts, heat sealed it, filled it with hot glue, and attached it onto my armor using contact cement. Next, I made this quarter note looking thing that mounts on either side of the armor. Before I could attach the quarter note looking panels, I needed to add a few more details, so I removed these little sections on both sides of the armor and cleaned it up with my Dremel. I cut out the center hole and the dotted area along the chest and cleaned it up with my Dremel. I added on this angled trim piece to outline the hip area that I made earlier. With those pieces out of the way, I finally glued on the quarter note trim piece. I stacked 2 sheets of 10mm HD foam together to make the midline chest piece, and after I cut it out, I rounded off the edges and used my heat gun to give it more of a curve. I used my wood burner to burn in a detail line for the midline chest flap. For the devastation beam, I have a 3-inch half dome that will be inserted into the foam piece here. I used my circle cutter to remove material that I didn't need so the half dome can squeeze through. I made a new template for the center flap, so I had to remake it again for the 3rd time. This project, I'm just winging it. Just whatever works, works, and whatever doesn't work, I just keep trying until something does work. So I just kept remaking this piece until I was happy with it. I added 2 strips of foam on the back. One is for the magnet and the other is for the hinge. And this is how it'll function with the hinge installed. I used my Dremel to drill a hole into the foam for my magnets. I applied a few layers of quick seal on my seams to clean them up and thin it out with water. Once I had the main construction done, I was able to cut it free from my mannequin. To allow me to get in and out, I glued on some straps and some Velcro. I glued on this trim piece on the front end, and on the back end I have a set of Velcro so it attaches over the initial Velcro system that I had to kind of cover all of that up. Next, I cut rib panels out of Plastizote, aka LED foam, and glued it in. I rounded off a few strips of 2mm foam and glued those in as well. I glued on this trim that attaches from the collarbone area down to the chest cavity. For the devastation beam, I applied a layer of yellow and let it sit overnight to dry. Next, I used a stencil to apply a darker layer of yellow to make the U pop out. Next, I went over with a few coats of red on the outside to finish it off. I have a set of constant torque hinges for the chest and midsection. I glued one side of the hinge on the underside of the front armor plate and glued the other end to the midsection. Next, I marked the spot for the magnets on the armor and the midsection flap. Next, I glued together the stomach light assembly. The red piece is just a piece of acrylic that I painted red. I burned some panel lines into the chest pieces and used a round tip to burn the details on the corner. I glued on my hinge with a few extra pieces of foam so it'll sit properly. I glued the other side of the hinge to the top of the chest piece. I added some magnets on the underside of the chest armor so the chest piece can snap into place. Here I installed an LED holder for the abdomen light. After that was done, I glued on the abdomen light assembly. Alright, and this was the progress so far. The little squiggly lines at the top, I was originally going to remove that material, but decided not to. I cut a few strips out of my half round dowel to add details to the chest pieces. Just a dab of super glue is enough to get these glued on. At this point I realized the hinges that I had were a bit too weak for the leverage from the chest pieces, so I added some magnets here at the top so when I pull them up they're able to stay in place. I removed some material from the back to make room for my fan so it can draw in fresh air, go through the tubes from the chest up to my helmet to keep me cool. I traced the outline of the fan on the back to remove that too. After that, I added on the remaining detail pieces to complete the back. Now I made some foam tubes cut at an angle and glued these on to various parts of the armor. I didn't film this part, but I did install the fan and build a box around it with tubes leading from that box to the individual tubes so the air can flow through, and of course use a bigger tube for the spine as well. I glued the foam strip underneath the main armor, housing the devastation beam and the two nipple lights, and those are housed with the LED foam as well. Once the construction was done, I applied a few coats of Plastidip, and once it was dried, I applied a few more coats of the glossifier so I could have a nice glossy black base coat for the all-clad black chrome and regular chrome. After letting everything dry for a while, I finally went over with my black chrome paint. After painting, I applied a few light coats of my sealer. I applied a few light coats of red for the nipple lights, and for the side, I applied a few coats of yellow. And now for the part that took me so long. I have one board that controls the lights, which basically runs off the same code as the Z-Saber that I made last video, minus the sound. And I have a separate soundboard for the actual sounds that I wanted to make. I split my circuits for the light to support two different lights. I have the individual LEDs and I have my LED strip that will be powering the devastation beam. I still have the connections from the fan itself, so it will be powered through the board for the LEDs and a separate switch for the actual fan so it can turn on. Right here you can see the separate battery pack and switch for the actual fan to turn on, so I have that as a standalone system compared to the rest of the lights and everything. This is the soundboard assembly with its own speaker and 4 buttons, so each button will be programmed for a sound. I cut out some circles out of LED foam and carefully glued on my LED strips on top. The LED foam helps diffuses the light and gives it a more convincing effect. I wired up my RGB fan to the LEDs and now it's able to light up.
We are controlling transmission.
Next, I installed the speaker into the bottom flap with a wedge of foam all glued together and fed the wires through the underside of the belly light. Once the speaker was done, I glued the wires to the armor to tidy up. Next, I installed my LED disc to the back side of the half dome and installed the individual lights. So these components that everything will basically plug into will be inserted into my gauntlet, or at least that's the plan anyway. I've already started patterning out the gauntlets themselves, so I should be able to get all of that stuff finished here pretty soon.
Fulgore!
Alright, and here is the completed chest armor in all its glory. So that was the full armor build. I can't wait to get the whole thing finished so I can show you my progress. But until then, I want to thank you all so much for watching, and y'all take care.